The Holy Gospel comes from St. John in the 13th chapter. Now, when he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. And if God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jewish people, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. So, in order to get into this little vignette from Jesus' final sermon to the disciples before he goes to die, I'm going to just let you in a little bit on a process that I have. So I know these texts are coming up, 3 years in advance because we use the Revised Common Lectionary. Theoretically, I can know what text is going to be read on any weekend indefinitely using this 3-year period. And many of these texts over the last 27 years, 9 times through, 27 divided by 3 is 9. I've been doing this 9 times, so I'm getting quite used to it, let us say. And so I know these things are coming out. So what happens is I know that eventually I'm going to be preaching on a text like this. And what I do is I kind of just sit in prayer until a line just sort of pops up in Scripture. And you've heard me do this a lot, where I'll talk about this particular thing that interests me about this story or text in any Scripture that I have. So when I was thinking about this text, what came to me is this line in verse 34, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another." So that kind of popped up at me. And so what happens is I don't really know why these things pop up at first, but they just kind of do. And I'm like, oh, interesting, love one another. And then I go back and I search in my history for why something like this may have struck my attention as I was praying over this piece. And this one was sometimes it's a difficult process. Sometimes it takes a week or 2 weeks in order for me to actually figure out why this particular verse that Jesus said struck or caught my attention. But this one was not too hard. When I thought about this text, it almost immediately popped up. I have a friend of mine that I've now known for well over 40 years. We went to high school together. He was a year younger than me in the school. But we were good friends and did a lot of things together while we were in high school. We were in many of the same activities. He was actually another Lutheran. And although there are a lot of Lutherans in the state of Minnesota, there are way more Roman Catholics. And where we lived, the Roman Catholic to Lutheran ratio was about 8-2. So Matt and I pretty much made up the 2, and everybody else was not. And so he didn't go to my congregation, but he was in a sister congregation of ours. And so anyhow, well, just over time, we kind of had the same things. We didn't always agree on stuff, but we just had a way of always being together. And he was this kind of guy that was just preternaturally talented. He was easily the most talented person in the school for the 3 years that we were there. And it didn't matter what he did. He was athletically gifted. He was smart. He could sing. I mean, he could dance. I mean, we won the state championship in drama all 3 years that he was with us, leading us. He was an actor. He just did a lot of stuff, and it was pretty clear that he was gifted for something beyond just being in high school. And but what was most interesting about him was not so much that he was talented or that he had all these gifts that he shared, and he shared them willingly. Very generous kid in those days. And I always just had a good time being around him. No matter what we did, whether we were running off to hear Handel's Messiah at the cathedral, or whether we were sneaking off to Chanhassen Theater to borrow some props for a play we were doing, or running around visiting churches, or just going down the river canoeing and kayaking. It was a good time. But one of the things that was interesting about him is that he only dated 2 girls in high school. And we always thought that was strange, because he could have, he could have had any girl, I think, in the high school. We had a huge high school. Remember, there were over 2,200 people in my high school, so a lot of folks. And I literally had people that would come up to me, and I'd say, hey, we're going to have a party. Would you like to come? And the girls would look at me and say, well, is Matt going to be there? And of course, I said yes. Whether I knew, he could have been visiting family in Wisconsin for all I knew, but he was going to be at that party. And so, that was just kind of what he was. But he always had one girlfriend. And he had one girlfriend for the first half of his high school career, and then that didn't work out, and he got a second girlfriend for the second half of his high school career. And they dated. Of course, I went off to college while he did his senior year, and I came back for Christmas that year, and I was hanging out with the gang who were still in school, and our mutual friend Paul. He said to me, I think Matt's really, really, really in love with this woman. And I said, well, he's always in love with whatever girl it is. That's the one. He's always in love. He says, I know. He says, you know that, Paul says, and I know that, but I don't know if she knows that. And I said, well, I hope to. And Paul says, well, I just hope that Matt doesn't have to die for her. And I said, okay. Didn't think anything of it. A couple weeks later, Paul told me that they were going to get married right after they graduated from high school. So Paul and I went back right in about 2 weeks after they graduated from high school. He got married. And we brought all our friends, and we hung out, and before the wedding, we took bets on how long the marriage was going to last. I didn't know her very well, so I went with 18 months. It turns out that I had the longest one. It lasted 20, so theoretically they all still owe me. But he never really got over it. They went to college out in New York, and as we went to visit him and stuff like that, he never seemed to really get over it. She left after about 20 months, like I said. Because he would be the kind of guy that would die for you, take a bullet for you, that kind of guy. He really loved her. It was obvious the day he married her. It was obvious to all of us when we visited over those 20 months, and then she just up and left. Well, he went on to be quite famous, actually. Turns out that high school was not his glory days. Springsteen will have to write another song about my friend Matt, because he went on to do some great things. And I caught up with him a few years later. He was in Broadway doing a play. You may have heard of it. It was called The Titanic. And we were talking, and he found another woman, and he was going to marry her. She's an actress. And they did indeed get married. They had a kid. And when the kid was 5 years old, this woman died of cancer. So when we saw him again, we were, here was this poor guy who had so much love for people, just sort of would give anything for them, and these people were just kind of coming into his life, and they weren't staying. And a few years ago, now I guess getting closer to 18, so it's been a while, met another woman, this time on a show called Law and Order. You may have heard of that show. I don't know. I don't watch TV, so. So he was there, and he met another actress, and they got married, and they had a kid, and whatnot. They're still together. And so, about twice a year, we send messages to each other. Facebook makes it easy to do that nowadays. We have some great experiences. Perhaps the greatest experience we ever had was I won some tickets at the Guthrie Theater, the old Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. I won some tickets to a concert, Christmas concert. And the concert was by Burl Ives. Quick show of hands. Anybody remember Burl Ives ever? Okay. How many hands do you think I'm going to get at 10:15 tomorrow? So seriously, we're sitting in this, we're as close to Burl Ives as Jimmy is to me, and sat there. Burl Ives at a 2.5-hour concert. Matt and I were clearly the youngest people. We were 18 years old or so at the time. We have great experiences. Stuff goes on, and he's still the same guy. I mean, chances are you've watched one of his TV shows, and he's an executive producer of TV shows nowadays, and chances are you've all seen one of his shows this week. So he's done a lot. He's pretty famous. And he still loves to the point of dying for somebody. And I think back when Jesus says, I'll give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Now, in and of itself, that commandment is not new. In fact, the Jewish tradition from which Jesus was raised, that was pretty much the only commandment. You love God, you love your neighbor as yourself. That was the Pharisaic training that Jesus had learned and was so much a part of his history and his tradition. So it's not new then to tell a bunch of disciples that you have to love one another. They already knew that. But what was new, of course, was that you have to love one another just as I have loved you. And of course, they didn't know how Jesus had loved them as they're sitting there listening to him talk that night. They heard that they were going to get a new commandment and that they were supposed to love each other just as Jesus has loved them. And they're like, well, what does that mean? And then, of course, within 72 hours from this particular time he said this, they would know as he hanged on a cross and bled and died because he loved them so much. The way in which we think about our Christian faith and the work that we do as disciples of Jesus revolves around this particular commandment. It's not new in the sense that nobody else has ever heard of it, but it's new because every single time we meet somebody, we're asked to love to the point of giving our life. And you know if you've loved somebody, if you'd give your life for them. It's nothing actually all that strange. Somebody who dies for somebody else is the highest form of love that we know, and there are stories about it. Even people who give their lives for causes like freedom or liberty understand what it means to love to the point of death. And what Jesus is asking us to understand is that this is finally what we're going to be known for, is how much we've loved. Have we been willing to love somebody, at least one person, to the point where we would be willing to die for them? That we would be willing to sacrifice everything to have that person in our life. Because when we hit that point, we have finally hit the depth that the relationships that God has created for us are meant to have. To be able to say to somebody that I would give everything in order to have you in my life or be with you, whatever the case may be, is precisely why God has created us in the first place. And however you may find that, whether you find that in a spouse or a nephew, or you find it in some person who has become an important mentor to you, somebody that you would give your life over for, you have understood finally what Jesus is asking of us. He's not asking for us to sort of cloister ourselves with a couple of people that we trust a lot, but rather to make a risk, to be in relationship, and to love until there is nothing left to give. Like my friend Matt, who's done it, whose first spouse wasn't able to receive it, whose second spouse unfortunately died, and seems to be going well the third time around for him. But whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be a spouse. It could be an idea, a hope, a dream that God has placed in you. To be able to reach into the depths of our human experience and to be able to plumb the hopes and the fears, the stresses and the strains that such love brings is precisely why Jesus asks us to love one another. Because finally, without that love, we'll all collapse. You might not know it, but there is somebody out there in the world who loves you that much. And I know this because without that love that was giving you that support and strength, you wouldn't be here tonight listening to me. Somebody somewhere loves you. And hopefully that person is close enough for you to be able to say thank you or how are you doing? But if not, know that it's there, or you'd never get up in the morning. That what God has brought to us in this world is a sense that we are so deeply ingrained and embedded with each other, that the love that we share comes at great pain and cost. And the reason why it's a new commandment is not because it's new, but because it is such a struggle. We have to be able to get away from all the stuff that gets in the way of our lives. People who come to our lives too short, whose life is taken by a disease like cancer. Or people who come into our lives but aren't able to reciprocate or find a way for their own selves to discover this truth of humanity, and so they flitter away off the edges of our page. To be able to live in this world that God has created us is to trust deeply in each other and to trust deeply in the God who has implanted this love so deep within us. So as Christians, we don't stand and say that we're the only ones who love, but rather we stand and say that we love deeply. We love deeply, arm in arm, locked together, brothers and sisters all across this globe, so that the reality of God's love can continue to spew from us, to be able to spread out into the world, to bring hope and grace and peace wherever it may go. So when you think about the new commandment, I hope that you can find someone in your life that you can love. And I want you to also be grateful that somewhere out there, not only is there someone who loves you, but so does God in a way that almost hurts. Amen.